Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're heading back, way back to the late Cretaceous to talk about a real giant, Beibeilong.
Ah, yes, the baby dragon. That's
Yeah.
what the name means in Chinese, right?
Exactly. And what makes this deep dive so cool is that, well, a lot of what we know comes from this amazing embryonic skeleton nicknamed Baby Louie.
And the huge eggs found with it. It's quite a story.
It really is. So we're drawing on the scientific papers here, the ones detailing the discovery, the classification, its characteristics, those eggs.
Its nesting behavior, the whole environment it lived in, mostly that big 2017 paper that formally described it.
Right. So our mission today, yours and mine and yours listening, is not just to get our heads around how big this thing was.
Oh, that's impressive enough.
It is.
Yeah.
But also to unpack the discovery itself, which is kind of a wild ride, how the fossils traveled the world, and what this baby dragon tells us about its slice of the late Cretaceous. Okay, let's get right into it. How did this giant first pop onto the scene?
Well, the story really starts back in China's Henan province.
Yeah.
In the Gaogu Formation.
Right, the geological layers there.
Exactly. And it was, let's see, between 1992 and 93, local farmers started finding, well, a lot of fossil dinosaur eggs.
And as often happens, these weren't exactly kept under lock and key right away, were they?
No, unfortunately not. A lot of them ended up outside China. Rock shows, markets, private collections.
Bad for immediate science, maybe.
Well, yes and no. It meant they weren't studied right away, but this spread actually kind of inadvertently set the stage for what came next.
Because one specific bunch of eggs had something incredible inside. Tell us about Baby Louie.
Right. So, among the eggs dug up by a farmer, Zhang Fengken, there was this amazing partial block.
Okay.
And inside, not just several of these massive eggs, but also this beautifully preserved little skeleton, about 38 centimeters long, an oviraptorosaur embryo.
Wow.
This was late 92, early 93. And that little skeleton eventually got the name Baby Louie.
And its journey from, like, a field in China to becoming this key scientific specimen, that was quite something.
Oh, absolutely. So 1993, this block gets imported into the U.S. by the Stone Company. They did the initial prep work, which is super delicate stuff. Then 1996, boom, it's on the cover of National Geographic.
The cover for an embryo.
Yep, that's when it got the nickname Baby Louie.
Yeah.
After the photographer, Louis Hoyos.
That's pretty amazing, getting a magazine cover before it even had a proper scientific name. A real star fossil. What happened then?
Well, in 2001, the Indianapolis Children's Museum acquired it, put it on display for, about 12 years.
So lots of people got to see it.
Millions, probably.
Yeah.
But, serious scientific study was a bit limited then.
Yeah.
But thankfully, in 2013, things changed. A repatriation agreement was worked out.
Ah, fantastic. So it finally went home.
Precisely. December 2013, Baby Louie was returned to China. It's now safe and sound at the Henan Geological Museum.
That's great news.
And crucially, in 2015, paleontologists went back to the spot Zhang Fengken said he found it, and they found eggshell fragments. Perfect match.
Wow. So they confirmed the exact location.
Yep, confirmed its origin, the Hamoga locality, late Cretaceous, Gaogu Formation, no doubt.
So more than 20 years later, the provenance is locked down. And then came the formal science bit.
Yes. 2017, Han Pu and colleagues published the big paper, the full analysis.
Okay.
And that's when it got its official name, Beibeilong sinensis. Baby Louie, specimen HGM 41HII 1219, became the holotype,
The reference
the
specimen.
gold standard. And they also noticed something else. Inside one of the other eggs, looked like maybe remains of a second embryo.
Whoa. And that name, Beibeilong. It really captures that link, doesn't it? Between the tiny baby and the giant it would become.
It really does. Baby dragon. Perfect. And sinensis, well, that just means from China. Straightforward.
Okay, so we have this baby dragon embryo, these absolutely enormous eggs. Let's get a sense of scale. Just how big did adult Beibeilong get?
Right. So based on that embryo size and knowing it's linked to those Macrolongitudinous eggs, the estimate is pretty staggering.
Lay on us.
Adult Beibeilong, probably around 7.5 meters long. That's what, 25 feet?
25 feet. Okay.
And weight-wise, maybe 1.5 to 2 metric tons. So 1.7 to 2.2 short tons?
That's rhino territory. Maybe a big rhino.
Exactly. A seriously hefty dinosaur.
So definitely one of the heavyweights in the oviraptorosaur world.
Oh, absolutely. Beibeilong was a massive chenagnathid, right up there among the largest oviraptorosaurs we know. Very close to Gigantoraptor in size.
Okay, so try to picture this giant in your mind, everyone. What's the general look?
Okay, so like its cousins, it walked on two legs, Bipedal, strong legs, obviously.
Right.
Probably had a fairly small head for its body size on the end of a long neck.
Graceful neck.
Likely, yeah. And the jaws, classic Oviraptorosaur,
Yeah.
toothless. Instead, it had this sharp, horny beak, a rhamphotheca.
Beak instead of teeth.
Right. And its hands, long fingers, big curved claws, useful for, well, we'll get to diet later, and a decent-sized tail for balance.
And feathers. That's always the big question with these guys.
Good question. Feathers are pretty common across Oviraptorosaurs, including some canagnathids. So yeah, it's highly probable Beibeilong had feathers too.
So a giant feathered, possibly rhino-sized, sort of bird-like dinosaur?
Kind of. Although there's a thought that maybe the really, really huge ones, like Gigantoraptor and maybe Beibeilong, might have had reduced feathers. Getting rid of body heat at that size can be a problem.
Thermoregulation. Makes sense. Okay, this is where it gets super interesting for the anatomy nerds listening. Let's dig into some specifics. What made Beibeilong's skeleton unique?
Okay, the skull is key. Like we said, totally toothless. Canagnathed trait. The very front bone of the upper jaw, the premaxilla, it had this rough, rugose texture.
Which points to the beak again.
Exactly. Strong evidence for that horny beak. Now, the bone behind it, the maxilla, was quite short and low. And this shapes that big opening in front of the eye, the antorbital fenestra. In Beibeilong, there's a depression there, the antorbital fossa. And here's the unique bit. 2 quite prominent ridges on the maxilla inside that fossa.
Just in Beibeilong.
So far, yes, that seems to be its signature feature there. Also, its nasal bones were fused together, formed the nostril area, had little holes for blood vessels.
And you mentioned distinctive bits around the eye socket, too. Lacrimal and frontal bones.
Yeah. The lacrimal bone in front of the eye was sort of crescent-shaped. And interestingly, it had a little dip on its upper back edge where the frontal bone part of the skull roof could slightly overlap it.
That specific overlap is that diagnostic feature.
It helps tell Beibeilong apart, yeah.
Yeah.
The frontal bone itself was a bit dome-shaped, made up the top of the eye socket and skull roof.
And the rest of the skull. Jaw joints and things.
Pretty typical Oviraptorosaur stuff, but with subtle differences. The jugal, postorbital, quadrijugal, quadrigerate. They all fit together in slightly specific ways, like the articular bone, part of the jaw joint, had this backward-pointing process with a noticeably concave surface. Little details like that.
Okay, moving down the body, anything stand out in the backbone or the limbs?
Sure. Some neck vertebrae had those big hollows, pluricoles, air sacs, basically, to lighten the neck.
Like in birds?
Exactly. The tops of the neck vertebrae, the neural arches, had low spines and looked sort of X-shaped from above. Then the hip region, strong, fused section. 6 sacral vertebrae. Shoulder blade, the scapula, was thin, strap-like, connected to the wishbone, the furcula,
Right.
and the main hip bone, the ilium. It had this gently curved top edge. And the front part, the preacetabular process, was clearly longer than the back part, the posticetabular process. That's another Beibeilong characteristic.
What about the legs? The femur, tibia?
Okay, the femur, thigh bone, pretty sturdy, bit longer than the pubis bone. But interestingly, unlike a lot of its relatives, it was missing a specific ridge, the crista trochanteris. And another muscle attachment point, the accessory trochanter, was poorly developed. And the shin bone, the tibia, was also missing a distinct bump on its upper crest, the caninial crest that you see in some others.
So it's this cool mix, right? Lots of familiar Oviraptorosaur features, but then these specific, unique tweaks that really define Beibeilong. Okay, let's switch to those incredible eggs. You mentioned Macrolongitudinus sinensis. Tell us more. They sound enormous.
They are enormous. Macrolongitudinus sinensis eggs are, hands down, the largest dinosaur eggs ever found. And they're tightly linked to these giant canagnathids like Beibeilong.
How big are we talking?
Picture something, 40 to 45 centimeters long.
Whoa, like a watermelon, a skinny watermelon.
Yeah, about that length. Really elongated, rounded ends, and this really rugged, bumpy surface texture.
And we call it an oospecies.
Right, because sometimes you find just the eggs or eggshells without the parent dinosaur, so they get their own classification based on shell features. But here, finding baby Louie with these eggs, that's a pretty solid link. These were almost certainly Beibeilong eggs.
Makes sense.
And
the shell structure itself, under the microscope, what did that show?
yeah, the microstructure is informative too. It had 2 main layers, an outer continuous layer and an inner layer with these little cone-like structures called the mammillary layer.
Okay.
The boundary between them was wavy, and the shell itself was pretty thick, 1.7 to maybe 2.5 millimeters. The outer surface texture had these scattered nodes, sometimes forming little ridges or chains.
Does that texture tell us anything?
It might relate to the nesting environment, maybe moisture levels, or even something about the mother's physiology. Still debated.
And how are these giant eggs laid out in a nest?
Good question. Based on finds like the baby Louie one, the standard Macrolongitulithus nest seems to be ring-shaped. Yeah, maybe one layer, possibly two layers of eggs arranged in a circle, with this quite large empty space right in the middle.
Empty space. Why?
Well, that leads to this really cool hypothesis. Given how massive Beibeilong was, maybe it didn't sit on the eggs like a bird.
Ah, it would crush them.
Exactly. So the idea is the parent might have actually settled down inside that empty center to incubate them. Close enough for warmth, but not squashing them.
That's an amazing picture, this huge dinosaur carefully lowering itself into the middle of a ring of giant eggs.
Oh.
Okay, solid picture now. The size, the look, the eggs. Where does Beibeilong fit in the bigger dinosaur family picture?
Right, so that 2017 analysis by Apu and colleagues, it placed Beibeilong pretty firmly within the Mechinothoidea superfamily.
Okay, broad group.
And then more specifically in the Gigantoraptor family. But within that family, it looks like it's in a fairly basal position.
Meaning primitive, an early branch.
Sort of, yeah. Like an earlier offshoot on the connected branch of the tree. It still has some of the ancestral features of the group. Their analysis, looking at all the shared characteristics, consistently put it there, even when they tried to account for changes between embryo and adult.
So what are the main things that make connecthids different from, say, the oviraptorids? People might know Oviraptor itself better.
Good point. There are some key differences, especially in the skull and hands. Oviraptorids, generally deeper jaws, higher nasal openings in the skull, often more complex hand structures. Think of the Hyaeninae group within them.
Right.
Connecthids, like Beibeilong, tend to have skulls that are more elongated, pointier, flatter, lower nasal openings, and their hand claws are usually a bit simpler.
But didn't both groups end up with crests on their heads sometime?
They did, which is fascinating. It's a great example of convergent evolution. Different groups independently evolving similar features, maybe for display, maybe for something else.
Interesting. And comparing baby Louie, the embryo, with the adult Gigantoraptor, did that shed more light?
It did. They looked at them as basically snapshots of different life stages for these giant connecthids.
Okay.
There were some differences in proportions, like the ratio of lower jaw length to thigh bone length. But thinking is that's mostly down to growth, different ages.
Allometry, right. Things growing at different rates.
Exactly.
Yep.
For instance, some skull bones, like the dentary lower jaw, probably fused up after hatching and then didn't grow quite as much relative to other parts as the animal ballooned up to adult size.
Right. Okay, let's shift focus a bit. How did Beibeilong live? What did it eat? There was some back and forth about diet in connecthids, wasn't there?
There was, yeah. An earlier idea from Xu Wang and colleagues suggested maybe the young ones had teeth that they lost as they grew up.
Teeth in an oviraptorosaur.
Well, they pointed to some grooves and ridges on certain jaw bones, thinking maybe they were traces of tooth sockets. But Gregory Funston and his team came back with a strong counterargument. Looking at the evolutionary tree, they reckon simple, toothless jaws were actually the starting point, the ancestral state, for connecthids.
Okay.
And crucially, the adult Gigantoraptor close relative, fully grown giant, shows absolutely no sign of teeth.
So the evidence points towards toothless adults.
Strongly. It seems most likely they were toothless throughout life, just using those beaks.
So probably beak-based feeders. Okay, what about nesting? We touched on the ring nests.
Right, the layout and the size of those Macrolongitulithus eggs with baby Louie. It's strong evidence for those big ring-shaped nests. Big empty middle, maybe 2 layers of eggs.
And baby Louie itself being so young.
Exactly. It's described as perinate, meaning very close to hatching or just hatched. Finding it like that with the eggs strongly suggests the nest was pretty far along in incubation when, disaster struck and it got buried.
And comparing this to smaller oviraptorosaurs really highlights the size difference, doesn't it?
It does. Research by Kohei Tanaka and others looked at lots of oviraptorosaur nests. Clear pattern.
What's the pattern?
Smaller species. Tightly packed rings, small empty center. Suggests they sat right on the eggs, brooding like birds.
Makes sense.
But the giants, Beibeilong, Gigantoraptor, proportionally much bigger, empty centers in their rings.
Supporting that idea of sitting in the middle.
Exactly. Sit in the middle, avoid crushing things, but still provide warmth. Although, it's worth remembering, While some fossils show direct brooding, other nests suggest maybe sometimes the parents were just guarding, or maybe just there during egg laying. It might not have been one single behavior.
Fascinating. So these giant baby dragons were likely quite attentive parents, even if they sat funny. Okay, let's paint a picture of the world Beibeilong lived in. The Gaogu Formation paleo environment.
Right, Gaogu Formation, late Cretaceous, specifically Cenomanian Coniation ages. That puts us around 96 to 88 million years ago.
Okay. What was the landscape like?
The rocks conglomerates, sandstones, mudstones, they suggest things like alluvial fans, braided rivers. Seems like it was a relatively dry, subtropical or maybe tropical climate overall, but with these river systems creating more humid floodplain areas.
And the plants. Any clues?
Yeah, looking at carbon isotopes in eggshells, it suggests the plant eaters there were munching on a mix of C3 plants, which are common, but also a decent amount of C4 plants.
C4 plants. Grasses. Or other types.
C4 photosynthesis is common in grasses today, but also evolved in other groups. Having a mix like that often points to conditions that are subhumid to maybe subarid, warm, but not necessarily lush everywhere. We also find amber from Araucariaceae conifers, so those were around.
And this ancient world, it wasn't static, was it? Evidence of climate change?
No, definitely not static. The geology points to significant climate shifts in the Gaogu ecosystem. Seems like there was a trend towards drying out over time.
Uh-oh. Bad news for big animals.
Potentially, yeah. Less rain, less reliable water in the rivers and floodplains. That would hit the plant life hard.
Which hits the herbivores.
Exactly. Might have forced migrations, put pressure on populations. These long dry spells could have really stressed the whole ecosystem, maybe contributed to eggs failing to hatch, local declines. Although it's interesting, we keep finding these giant kinagnathids like Beibeilong in river-related sediments.
Suggesting they stuck close to the water sources.
It hints they might have preferred those relatively better watered areas, yeah.
So a challenging, changing world, even for a giant like Beibeilong.
Yeah.
Who else was around? Any other familiar neighbors?
Well, the Gaogu Formation has given us other cool stuff. Another big dinosaur, the sauropod Boeotian
A long neck.
Yep. Also turtles like Uchelies, lots of freshwater clams, snails, little crustaceans called ostracods, and trace fossils from insects. So a diverse community, even if it was facing some environmental stress.
Okay, last piece of the puzzle. Baby Louie itself, the fossil preservation. What does taphonomy, the study of how things fossilize, tell us about its final moments?
Right, well, the fact that the little skeleton was found outside its egg and kind of not aligned with the other eggs, it suggests something moved it. Maybe just after hatching, maybe even before, an external force.
Not a peaceful hatching scene then.
Probably not. We also see damage that looks like scavenging or erosion. The skull's partly collapsed. The tips of the beak bones are damaged.
Scavenging. Animals.
Possibly. And definitely insects. There are little boreholes and burrows on some bones. Clear sign of postmortem insect activity.
Wow.
Plus, a lot of the tiny bones were disarticulated, separated from each other. Suggests things got jumbled around a bit before final burial. And the tail. Its position wasn't clear. Maybe tucked under, maybe missing.
It really puts into perspective how much information can be lost and how amazing it is we find anything this complete. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive on Beibeilong, what are the big takeaways for you?
For me, it's the whole package. The sheer size is mind-boggling for an oviraptorosaur, pushing those boundaries. Then there's the incredible story of baby Louie itself, that journey from discovery to fame to repatriation. It highlights how important these signs are and how global paleontology is.
Yeah, that journey's amazing.
And the eggs, those giant eggs, what they suggest about nesting.
Yeah.
It's a unique window into giant dinosaur parenting, possibly. And finally, seeing this creature in its context, that dynamic, changing late Cretaceous world in China, it really underscores the challenges and adaptations that shaped life back then.
Absolutely. And maybe for you listening, just consider for a moment the challenges a creature this huge and its relatively delicate eggs and young would face in a world where the climate is shifting under its feet. Fossils like baby Louie are these incredible, rare snapshots, aren't they? Glimpses into survival, adaptation, and sometimes, yes, extinction in these ancient worlds.
Well said. There's always more to uncover.
There certainly is. We definitely encourage you to keep exploring the world of oviraptorosaurs and the late Cretaceous. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.